Hello, everyone, and welcome to this, which is going to be our final installment, our final recording for Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. And this is chapter 20, which is entitled The Future in Perspective. And the first section is going to be Darin talking about a little section called, I shouldn't call it a little, it looks sizable, but it's called The Unfolding of Time. And I'm excited about this chapter, not just because we're almost at the end of it, which is bittersweet, I think, because it's been enjoyable, but because I think I think that Carroll Quigley did an excellent job of wrapping up all of his thoughts. I don't agree with them all, but there's so much food for thought in this chapter. So, Darin, here you go.
Okay, great. Hi, welcome everyone. And it's been over a year. We've gone through, we're one of the few people on planet Earth that we can proudly say we've gone through Carroll Quigley's tome from beginning to end. And anyone who makes the effort is, I think, very well rewarded. Even if his history ends in the 1960s, particularly this chapter 20, I think carries over to today quite well. This last chapter is the future in perspective, and it consists of 3 parts or 4 parts, and the first one is the unfolding of time, which I'll cover now. Right at the very beginning of this chapter, I made a little criticism. I just found it a little bit strange. He sort of stated the obvious a bit too much here. In an age of change and competing doubts, there is one thing of which we can be certain: the world is changing. Okay, all right. That seemed a little bit unnecessary to double up on. He said human beings are basically conservative in the sense that they expect and wish to continue to jog along in the same old patterns. And as you see when we get towards the latter part of this section, he will explain the bounding virtues of the Western world, the Western philosophy, that the West is very liberal and it stands juxtaposed to the rest of the, I suppose, unenlightened or possibly even barbaric world. So he goes on to just, mention in the modern age that people, although they are resistant to change, they have adapted to it. And he goes on to then describe later about how the adaptations to this change are really maladaptations. And there's a lot to take away from that part of it. And you actually see it playing out in our modern world once again in the social, all these social apps and these digital lives we lead online. He just mentions right off the bat that people are sort of adapted, in air quotes. You have a modern world which is trying to sell something to itself, to everyone else, and so your winter fashions are thought about the summer before, and often sold before winter starts, and way with many things. So people are living lives to satisfy their future orientations or the future orientations of everybody else. And everybody's lives have become much narrow in a total aspect. People's jobs have become far more specialized in the modern era, where meaning is being lost. So Quigley takes us through existentialism, and which is the most sort of common philosophical talking point of the modern time. What is the meaning of life? In such an age, the sensible man can only reconcile himself to the fact change is inevitable. But few men, average or exceptional, feel any competency in deciding the direction that change will take. Then he mentions forecasting, and that is an entire subject which I found fascinating when I actually did a marketing course, and statistics, first year statistics were part of the course. And I can see why the elite, why the massive corporates are so obsessed with gathering data. I remember, I think it's called correlation and regression. And you if you have enough data and you input it into a statistical formula, you can even sort of work out future projections of that data, but you can build in degrees of probability. I found statistics quite amazing, because with good data, you can actually predict future outcomes pretty well, and that's why these guys are so. That's why data is so important, especially with this technocratic world government economic system that's coming into place. It's going to rely on data, and data is going to be like gold or platinum. It already is, but it's going to really ramp up. In attempting this risky procedure of forecasting, we shall continue to divide society into 6 aspects. So quickly, when considering the future, he divides, he anticipates 3 main categories. He talks about power, which he divides into military and politics. The second, he talks about reward, social and economic patterns, and outlooks, which he divides into religious and intellectual patterns. So that was the opening sort of intro to the chapter, the unfolding of time. The political conditions of the latter half of the 20th century will continue to be dominated by the weapons situation. So Quigley just reminds us about what he's written earlier on in Tragedy and Hope. He reminds us of how important weaponry is to establishing spheres of influence, how far sphere of influence can reach beyond its center, and how the sophistication and availability of weapons can influence the size of a state and the freedom of the people within a territory or a state. So when weapons are of the amateur type of the 1880s, as they were in Greece in the 5th century, they are widely possessed by citizens. Power is similarly dispersed, and no minority can compel the majority to yield to its will. So basically speaking, everyone is able to cheaply acquire the same level of force. And so if anyone comes around trying to lean on another person, that person has got he's guaranteed an equal measure of force that he can apply back to defend himself. And so freedoms are preserved and manners are improved when every man is wary of the other man's ability to apply force. And then he says, well, on the contrary, when a period can be dominated by complex and expensive weapons that only a few persons can afford to possess or can learn to use, we have a situation where the majority who control such specialist weapons can dominate the majority who lack these weapons. In such a society, sooner or later, an authoritarian political system that reflects the inequality and control of weapons will be established. And we've seen that. I also made a note. I said, he's talking about physical weapons explosives, etc. And he also goes on to mention chemical weapons and biological weapons. But I just made a note saying that the weapons are also specialized. The weapons that they have are also psychological weapons. And it's those quiet weapons for silent wars that we've heard about, and how incredibly powerful TV is, for example. That's a weapon. It's probably the weapon that is not called a weapon. He also mentions that a period that is not democratic in its political structure is not in itself necessarily bad, and may well be one in which people can live a rich and full social or intellectual life, whose value may be even more significant than a democratic political or military structure. He then goes on to contrast two sort of scenarios of amateur weaponry versus professional weaponry. So the amateur weapons of the late 19th century were made possible, these weapons made possible the mass citizen armies that fought the American Civil War. And because everybody got involved or could get involved in war, war tended to be total. It was a case of, it wasn't just a case of trying to persuade your neighboring state to adopt your view. It had to be a case of, we better wipe them off the map completely, or absolutely and thoroughly subdue them. Because if we didn't do it to them, they were going to do it to us. Because the weapons were so common between everyone. So total warfare. The reasons that they had to invent to fight one another were mostly ideological. They were protecting their way of life, making the world safe for democracy, ending slavery. So it resulted in extreme total suffering, versus what Quigley sees as something that will actually help mankind in the long run, is when weapons of war become highly specialized and in the hands of professional armies. He says, we may look forward with some assurance to less and less demand for total wars, being using total weapons of mass destruction to achieve unconditional surrender and unlimited goals. Let's see here. The rather naive American idea that wars aim to involve the destruction of the enemy's regime and the imposition of the defeated people of a democratic system with a prosperous economy will undoubtedly be replaced by the idea that an enemy regime must be maintained, perhaps in a modified form, so that we have some government with whom we can negotiate in order to obtain our more limited aims. To lower the level of conflict as rapidly as possible. So going from total conflict with weapons that are easy to get for just about everyone, conflict changes from total war to controlled war or controlled conflict. Then he discusses the future with regards to nuclear weapons. Very simply put, the two main nuclear powers in his time were the United States and the Soviet Union. He goes on to discuss how these two nuclear powers came to realize that even if one side initiated the conflict, as they acquired greater reach in limited distance ballistic missiles, they could go for now intercontinental ballistic missiles, and as one got the other, then the other caught up, and then you had the Polaris submarines, the Polaris missiles on the nuclear submarines, which, as soon as Russia got the advantage in a particular area with a particular, let's say, much larger nuclear weapon, even if Russia actually got off the first salvo and managed to inflict an almost crippling blow to the United States, the United States nuclear submarines could, because you don't know where they are, they could be then unleashed on the Soviet Union, and no one would be the winner. One might suffer casualties and a total sort of loss first, but the other one didn't really maintain any advantage because of that. The other could come back and do just as much damage. So the two superpowers, they actually cancelled each other out. And this cancelling out also carried on further down the line to even conventional warfare with conventional weapons. Because if the conventional side of war became, if one side was gaining an upper hand and were really threatening the home state, that home state still had the capacity to then unleash nuclear weapons back at them, and no one wanted that. So the nuclear weapons stalemate actually resulted in a stalemate between these two superblocks, even when it comes to conventional warfare. And from World War II, we haven't seen a direct conflict between the two superpowers. And then Quigley goes on to talk about how this stalemate between the two superblocks actually enabled the neutral states, or those states who don't want to pick a side with the West or Russia, those uncommitted states, he calls them, how it gives these neutral states the ability to get involved in international politics and to throw their toys out the cot and to make demands, to get involved in the UN, and to punch above their weight when they don't necessarily have the means to back it up. And the reason why these neutral or uncommitted states can do what they do is that what they have done, and what some still do, is that they will say to the United States, look, like Cuba did with Russia, we are on your side. We approve of the communist system, and we are going to be the spokespersons and the guardians, and we're going to hold communism in trust. And they could hold the Soviet Union and get them to be compliant with supplying them with weapons, etc., etc. If the Soviet Union didn't play along, well, then they could just switch sides and make life a little bit more difficult for the other side. So Quigley writes, the stalemate between the two superpowers on the use of nuclear weapons also extended to the use of lesser non-nuclear weapons, which we've discussed. This meant that the use of nuclear tactical weapons and the use even of conventional tactical weapons were inhibited to an undetermined degree by the presence of nuclear strategic weapons no one wanted to see used. That's the conclusion. Let's see here. Indeed, the very idea of winning a general war is now almost unimaginable. we do not even know what we mean by a win. So he goes, why the war? Oh, sorry, I wrote here, understanding the stalemate, it helps us to explain things like the Ukraine war, why it's been so localized and kept to that eastern corner of the Ukraine for so long, when we know that the Soviet Union could walk right through Ukraine. They could, they could do it, but once they started unleashing that kind of power, they know what they could then, what it could result in. The response is not worth it. It's not worth taking it to that level. And Quigley then goes on to sort of say, science will save mankind. Glory, power, and wealth may all be obtained with less effort and greater certainty by non-warlike methods. As science and technology advance, making war more horrible, they also make it possible to achieve any aims at which war might be directed by other non-violent methods. He talks about spectrum, methods of influencing other states. You can be warlike. You can go from nuclear weapons in one extreme all the way through to sending chess teams across to play with each other and to, like USAID. I didn't really realize the involvement that the USAID had in Russia itself. It turns out they had quite a large presence there. So that would be the other side of the spectrum. He mentions when Khrushchev renounced the use of both nuclear war and conventional violence and promised to defeat the West by peaceful competition, he was dividing the spectrum into three levels. But in fact, it is a continuous spectrum with 100 megaton bombs at the upper end and Olympic Games, international geophysical years, and foreign economy at the other end. Khrushchev was very, very confident that they could outperform the United States, and that their socialist model, way of life, would become the model for emulation by the uncommitted nations. As it's turned out, we know socialism just doesn't work anywhere, and it's a case of the West is definitely at some point in time going to dominate the entire globe, and this has resulted in an ideological warfare. Quigley goes on to explain how the United States and the Soviet Union actually are with one another. And if you have been watching world geopolitics play out, you have the situation where the US and the Soviet Union never ever confront each other directly, but they always are trying to win over one state after the other to their ideological position. And no one ever wins. No one ever wins, no matter where they play out their competition. What ends up happening at the end of the day is that these countries end up having central banks. They are lined up with the United Nations and they adopt all of the UN agendas, and this is what it's really about. And I've held the view for a while that the Soviet Union and the United States are operating like a pair of pincers. There's two sides. There's two claws on a pincer. There's one pincer, and they operated by the same crab. And I do not believe at higher levels that the Soviet Union and the United States are enemies, even at an ideological level. I think they're working together. Quigley, sort of, if you read between the lines of Quigley, sort of says things like, it might also be worthwhile for us to consider what might be Russia's real goals. Obviously, preservation of the communist regime must have a higher level of desirability to Moscow than Castro's success in Cuba or the Kremlin's control of Budapest. Thus, to the Politburo, now as earlier under Stalin, continued control in the Kremlin has a higher priority than world revolution. So the West can help Russia's rulers get what they really want, which is their own domestic power, and at small cost in return for what they can want only secondarily, which is the expansion of communism. And we're never going to get a confession out of Quigley when it comes to the West's role in Fabian socialism. But there's just really 2 or maybe 3 branches of worldwide socialism that are stretching out their tentacles across planet Earth. They're all working for the same head. And Quigley never ever once says that directly. So he's saying the US should concede a little to the Russians so that communism holds on in Moscow, it saves face for Russia. Then they can continue that act where they are fighting for dominance over the neutrals and the uncommitted countries. And really, it's just a geopolitical strategy to get everyone standardized, plugged into the international banks and the UN. He also mentions that the Soviet Union has always been more conservative and less extremist in international matters than it appeared. Much of Khrushchev's truculence, even abroad, was for domestic rather than foreign consumption. The only real problem with regards to Russia, according to Quigley, is that Russia doesn't have a real policy in place to do with a strong continuance of a very strict policy after a particular leader leaves office. So, he says it's unlikely to be the case, but that's the only real obstacle that could arise from the Soviet Union, is a change in political direction. So the fact remains that there are in the Soviet Union no institutional safeguards for any policy. In this way, the superpower neutralization and the included nuclear stalemate will continue into the future. From this flow 3 consequences. Number 1, the movement of Soviet-Western rivalry down to lower, less violent levels of conflict and competition. 2, continued disintegration of the 2 superblocks from the inability of the chief power in each to bring force against its allies because of the need to accept growing diversity within each bloc in order to retain as much as possible the appearance of unity within the bloc. This is presented by Moscow's difficulties with China, for example, Albania and Romania. And number 3, a growing independence of the neutrals and uncommitted nations. Long story short is that bulletproof warfare is always going to be the economic kind. Let's see here. Yeah, he goes on. He's actually mentioned this before in different words early on in the book, how weaponry influenced the size and reach of territories, of states, and that states were normally limited in size and scope according to the ability of their weaponry to reach other areas. And as sophisticated and general technology related to weaponry opens up territory, the nation state has gone from lots of little tribes all the way down to large states. So the national state, its size, measured in hundreds of miles, was based to a considerable extent on the fact that the weapons system of the 19th century, founded on citizen soldiers with handguns and moved or supplied by railroads and wagons, could apply force over hundreds of miles. Thus, in many cases, proved to be approximately the same size as the European linguistic and cultural groupings or peoples, and accordingly, it became easy to base the popular appeal for allegiance to the state structure upon nationhood. That is the common language. And Quigley then goes on to explain how this is it's changed. It's ramped up. It's ramped up to the degree now where superblocks, these two superblocks have got, their weapons can extend their reach up to 8,000 miles. And it's the limits of what used to be limited to linguistics or nationhood is now a state. The state structure is no longer nationalistic, it's now ideological. So it's stretched across and it's taken in multiple cultures. He also mentions here languages and cultures covering lesser areas than those by the existing 19th century system of weapons and transport, such as the Welsh, the Bretons, the Provençals, the Basques, Catalonians, etc., by failing to become centers for one of these dominant weapons organized structures, and went into political collapse. It's quite interesting how he describes that. They don't even count anymore. They are just sucked in. So as the technology of weapons, transportation, communications, and propaganda continued to develop, it became possible to compel obedience over areas measured in thousands of miles, and thus over distances greater than those occupied by existing linguistic and cultural groups. It thus became necessary to appeal for allegiance to the state on grounds wider than nationalism. This gave rise in the 1930s and 1940s to the idea of continent and the ideological state. Okay, replacing the national state. So although we've got countries and we've got nation states, they, from the point of view of the United Nations and the large foundations and corporations that really run things, the nation state doesn't exist. We, the little people on the ground who support our national cricket team or football team, those little people are living so far in the past. How far in the past they're living? Well, this could go back even as far as the late 1800s. By 1950, Dulles and others talked of a two-power world as if consent could be obtained by only two powers, and as if each were hemispherical. They were not, for while the area of power organizations had expanded, they had not become hemispherical, and new counterbalancing factors had appeared that threatened to reverse the whole process. He goes on to mention the reach of superpowers, that they don't quite have a total global reach, and that there are zones of neutrality where they can't exert their authority. And you have the Soviet Union and you have the United States battling it out on these smaller groups. In this power gap between the less than hemispherical superpowers appeared the neutrals of the buffer fringe. Okay. But the new weapons and seeking increased range had become weapons. Okay, I see. the new weapons, in seeking increased range, have become weapons of mass destruction rather than instruments of persuasion. If the victims of such weapons are killed, they can neither obey nor consent. Thus, the new weapons have become instruments not of political power, but of destruction of all power organizations. So, if a major superpower wishes to exert the full extent of their power over a region, by default, they lose they lose the power to exercise power in the region that they win over, because you can't dominate people that are all dead. So these incredible weapons cancel each other out. Furthermore, they make them most ineffective against individual men, and especially against the minds of individual men. And finally, in an ideological state, it is in the minds of men that must be principal targets. He gets that a bit later on, where he discusses the nature of man, how man views himself. And it does boil down in Quigley's mind that the West will win ideologically in the end. Leaving nuclear weapons and weapons of explosive weapons behind, Quigley mentions that there are biological and chemical weapons that also create an enormous on the world scene. You see here. So with biological weapons and chemical weapons, they are quite cheap to acquire. With a little bit of extra care, a backward country can create these weapons and unleash them. But the thing is, as soon as they try and use them, they'll realize that they can be used back on themselves. Once again, these weapons cancel each other out. And to some degree, which is unknown to most of the world, these countries, whether they are backward countries or first world superbloc powers, everyone is using biological and chemical warfare weapons, but it's really, really kept hush-hush. So when we hear about there being 10 biolabs in the Ukraine, and we think that could just be a bit of a psyop, well, maybe it's true. We learn that these biological weapons can be used to attack the food supply of other countries. Very, very tempting to use, and yet they haven't been used as far as we know, not on a large scale. The danger of such biological weapons becoming common, or even becoming commonly known among the people of the world, including the less developed nations, is very great, opening an opportunity to all kinds of political blame, or even to merely irresponsible threats. There's also things like nerve gas. Another significant element in this complex picture is the convergence toward parallel paths of the United States and the Soviet Union. Just wanted to go back briefly. He speaks the people's. He says another reason why nuclear weapons are kind of useless to some degree is that you just get certain peoples that are invulnerable to the effect, because they are much more individualized. You can attack a certain area in Africa and the people will just break apart and carry on as before. It doesn't compel them to change their behavior. And he says the process is already observable, especially among the younger generation of the United States, Europe, and the Soviet Union. And to the young, in all three of these areas, there is a growing, if quiet, skepticism of any general abstract appeal to allegiance and loyalty, and a growing concern with concrete interpersonal relationships with local groups and friends. And I think that's got to do with an existential crisis that's occurred, where in the rush for material gain, the social side of life has been neglected to the point where younger generations are trying to pull back and find meaning. And right on time, the internet has come into play, I think, to possibly neutralize that effect. Has basically atomized society right down to the individual. As Alan mentioned, wasn't that, who was that? Was that Russell who mentioned that part, the atomization of society? Also, the internet has given everyone a global or a universal outlook. So, this is tragedy and hope. When did the internet come out? In the late 80s. So I think we need to include the effect of the internet here. Maybe Carroll Quigley wasn't as informed about what would be coming in with the internet, but it's definitely going to neutralize the fear that he mentions here with regards to people becoming Africanized or invulnerable to the persuasive effects of their efforts. A danger to their world order, he also mentions, is that if defensive weapons are improved and people are able to limit, countries would be able to limit the efforts of the globalists. That's very simply put there. Jumping ahead again to the convergent parallel paths of the United States and the Soviet Union. This is, of course, something which rabid partisans of either side will refuse to recognize. It arises from three directions. Quigley says there is an absolute convergence of interests between the two states. The structures of the two countries are to some extent changing in similar ways. And number three, as the only superpowers able to inflict or receive instant annihilation, these two countries to some extent stand apart from other states and in a class together. The last point is almost obvious, since it must be clear that only these two are prepared to engage in a race to the moon, or have an almost insatiable demand for mathematicians or space scientists. Both Russia and the USA face the same challenges as global geopolitics shapes up, as all the neutrals and the uncommitted countries sign up to the United Nations. And what really happens from a globalization point of view is that the actual role that both the United States and Russia will play in the world will diminish. That purpose to draw everybody in to a global system won't be needed anymore. And so both the Soviet Union and the United States will have to adjust their outlook to fit in with with their positioning within the new global order. Although he doesn't say it that way. So in both countries, the real needs, the needs of managing the new technological society, it outweighs party politics in both countries. It's the same. in both countries, trained experts and technicians as a consequence of a new educational process are replacing political figures or other social groups, especially political specialists in both the military leaders, although qualified for supreme influence by their position of power, are held at secondary level by personal manipulations. And it's the technocracy is taking precedent. And it's all these changes are happening roughly at the same. Well, what's happening in the United States is happening in the Soviet Union. In both countries, there's growing intellectual skepticism toward authority, accepted ideologies and established slogans, replaced by a rising emphasis upon the need for satisfactory small group interpersonal relations that he mentions again. So the ending of total warfare means the ending of war for unlimited aims, which are things like unconditional surrender, total victory, destruction of the opponent's regime and social system, fought with weapons of total destruction and a total mobilization of resources, including men, to a condition rather of constant, flexible, controlled conflict with limited, specific and shifting aims, sought by a limited application of diverse pressures applied against any other state whose behavior we wish to influence. Such controlled conflict would involve a number of changes in our attitudes and behavior. And there's 8 of them, or mention number 8. Number 8 mentions, among the methods we must be prepared to use in such a period must be diplomatic or tacit agreement with any other state, including the Soviet Union or Red China, to seek parallel or joint aims in the world. This will be possible if all aims are limited to specific goals, which each state will recognize are not fatal to its general position and regime, and by which one specific aim can be traded against another, even tacitly. This will become possible for the double reason that professionalization of the fighting forces and the growing productiveness of the superpower economies will not require either the total psychological mobilization or the almost total economic mobilization necessary in World War II. So what I think Quigley is describing there is that warfare will become much, much more businesslike. And although he never mentions these things directly, what we know is that the nation state doesn't really exist in a true sense. It's all run via decentralized authority or via the United Nations system, and they direct international affairs and send foreign affairs ministers back to their home countries to carry out various orders. So worldwide, warfare has become professional and very targeted and run in a business-like fashion, where they can target very specific groups of people in areas where they need to tie everyone up and to get them standardized and running. The Middle East is it's one which the world's been watching under a microscope for a long time. We can see how everything is standardizing there. The people that I speak to that go there, every time they describe the places to me, all these places have got McDonald's and that kind of thing. It's all very westernized and becoming more westernized all the time. So with controlled warfare, point 9, all this means is there's a blurring of the distinction between war and peace. I think that's quite important. With the situation at all times one of closely controlled conflict. In this way, endemic conflict is accepted in order to avoid, if possible, epidemic total war. The aims can be retained under controlled conflict, but will be lost by all concerned in total war. In spite of this shift in the whole pattern of international power relations, the Soviet Union will remain for a long time the chief adversary of the United States, a situation for which there is no real solution until a new and independent superpower rises on the landmass of Eurasia, preferably in a unified Western Europe. This reminds me of Jacques Attali. Jacques Attali also spoke of the possibility of Europe becoming a superpower again. But Jacques Attali seemed to favor the idea that it would be China that would be this third power. So, Jacques Attali, he was under his crystal ball told him that that China would rise, it would expand its territory, it would move its way into the eastern territories of Russia, probably parts of Siberia, and would push Russia into the west, and Russia would become, and all the Ukraine and Belarus, etc., would become part of an extended Europe. Or if it is Europe that becomes the dominant superpower, then Russia would probably form a merger with China. So both those situations are there. They're both possibilities. I didn't really comment much on the next 1216. Quigley goes on to describe the financial fiscal mindset of the West and how it is able to dominate. I'm not too strong on finance myself, and I think when you try and explain finances, it's a very, very difficult one to try and really bring across with all the terminology that is used. But essentially, the Western model, particularly the American financial model, it always invests its capital into vehicles that are able to be used very, very quickly to finance things that are new without having to diminish finance in other area. Whereas in Russia and other parts of the world, capital and resources are sort of, they are in a ratio of a 1-to-1 sort of locked mechanism. You can't have expansion in one area without sacrificing in another. And this gives the United States an enormous advantage over everyone else. So, see here, as a chief consequence of these financial conditions, the contrast between the have nations and the have not nations will become even wider. This would be of little great importance to the rest of the world were it not that the peoples of the backward areas, riding the crisis of rising expectations, are increasingly unwilling to be ground down in poverty, predecessors were. At the same time, the superpower stalemate increases the abilities of these nations to be neutral, to exercise influence out of all relationship to their actual powers, and to act sometimes in an irresponsible fashion. And I think of South Africa. South Africa has sort of been playing the give me freebies, getting assistance from America, getting assistance from the Russians, and essentially giving nothing back in return and showing nothing for it, and getting quite arrogant in the process. Some of the stuff that you've been seeing on the news with regards to Donald Trump and South Africa, with regards to AGOA, Donald Trump's statements aren't necessarily exactly true, but they're pretty close in other areas. And it'll be interesting to see what the Americans do with regards to the South African situation. Will they actually start expecting the money that they send to Africa to bear fruit? Will they start holding these freedom fighters accountable? Because, the ANC has been in power now since 1991, and all they've done is really enrich themselves and their comrades. And your average African his life hasn't improved very much. In actual fact, without raising the topic, I have had older African gentlemen say to me quite straightforwardly that he reckons things were better for him and his family under apartheid. And what he's meaning by that, he's not expressing himself in the fullest sense, but what he's really saying is that apartheid was terrible, but what I've got now is even worse because of just shocking mismanagement that's been going on. And America and these governments around Africa come out with the begging bowl, and the money never gets to the people. Let's see. Yeah. So these areas will be the chief sources of real trouble in the future. He's talking about the neutrals. These areas will be chief sources of real trouble in the future, for clashes between the United States and the Soviet Union, or even China, are likely to arise from direct conflicts of interests. Will arise from conflicts over the neutrals, and we've seen that for the last 70 years. These neutrals and other peoples of backward areas have acute problems. Solutions to these problems do exist, but the undeveloped nations are unlikely to find them. As we have indicated elsewhere, their chief problems are three: the relationship between population explosion and limited food supplies. And I'm sorry, but this is true. If you are in a visit a third world country, it hits you like a ton of bricks. People are struggling for survival, but you've got to call it quits somewhere when it comes to the number of children you have. You just have to. It's not a case of depopulation or eugenics. It's just common sense. My parents could have had 13 children and I could have grown up in poverty because of it. And my chances of success now would have diminished by 80%. Number two, the problems of political stability, especially the relationship between political aims and quite diverse weapons controls patterns. Three, the problem of obtaining constructive rather than destructive patterns of outlook. I think number three is the most pertinent point because a nation is not just a piece of land or territory. It's the people, and if the people have a certain mindset, a character trait, or whatever it is, and they, if you keep repeating the same thing over and over again, that doesn't work. You're never going to get out of your predicament, and that's the problem that we've got. I see it. It's very much the South African problem. It's a mental outlook that the Western way of running this sort of meaningless life of practicing some narrow, specialized job it doesn't sit well with many Westerners themselves, but it certainly is something that is just not culturally, it doesn't rub well amongst many African cultures. And I don't blame them. So let's see here. In general, these underdeveloped nations cannot follow American patterns through the Soviet system, despite its heavy costs and loss of personal freedoms. It's once again, South Africa is such a classic case. Your freedom fighters, your ANCs, your traditional African systems are actually quite well suited towards that strong collective mechanism. And so, the ANC, which is really controlled by the South African Communist Party, it is communist, where the European contingent of the South African population is, they feel Western, and they have this similar outlook that Quigley describes later in the book. And even though America is not popular at the moment and in the dog box with many people around the world, your westernized European South African very much aligns himself with the USA, because from a cultural, spiritual, that Western, all that Western outlook that Quigley describes is reflected in the European populations that are in Africa. So there's a conflict. Let's see here. As understood in Western Europe over the last 3 centuries, the state was the organization of sovereign power on a territorial basis. Sovereign meant that the state had supreme legal authority to do just about anything regarded as public in the public interest. This authority impinged directly on the subject without any intermediaries or buffer corporations, and did this in a dualistic power antithesis typical of the Greek two-valued logic that was applied to almost everything in the 17th century. As part of this sovereign system, it was assumed that rights of property and of permanent association were not natural or eternal, but flowed from grants of sovereign power that required the state's recognition in the form of a document or deed, and no corporation could exist except at the charter of the sovereign or with his tacit consent. Moreover, all citizens on the territory were subject to the same sovereign power. The latter consisted, as it still largely does in our tradition, of a mixture of force, economic rewards, and ideological uniformity. The once almost universal equivalence between residence and citizenship may be weakening. If the ideological state continues to develop its likely characteristics, persons of different ideologies and thus of different allegiances may become intermingled on the same territory. The number of refugees and resident aliens is now increased in most countries, so that's quite an important little point that he just makes a short statement there. This is where I read Quigley, and I don't know, he makes these statements, but he doesn't necessarily qualify the outcome of it all, or why it's been done, because it is done on purpose. It's not just a natural outflowing. He talks about federalism, the growing role that federalism will play in the world. He brings out, he raises Africa as an example. He speaks about the various Pan-African unions and the roles that various divisions of the World Health Organization play. in Africa. And the reason why this happens, or why it is happening to such a large degree in Africa in particular, is because there's a very large skills gap. A lot of the countries in Africa are very young. And so what happens is that a country might not be able to have the skill to run all facets of government on their own. So in a sense, what these states are doing, they're practicing a form of limited federalism. Quigley gives a few examples of how it doesn't work. But what happens with limited federalism is that each country can maintain a degree of its own, managing its own affairs, but it outsources certain aspects of its government needs to the various divisions that exist within the United Nations. So you can sort of see the United Nations and its various branches as governments or parts of governments on loan to countries who lack the expertise to manage various parts of their government. It's quite interesting. They outsource and resources where and when necessary to the UN and its pyramid of alphabet institutions. Multi-layered structure covering much of tropical Africa. So that is how Africa is being run. And that is why the UN has got such deep tentacles running through Africa. It makes more sense when you think of these various divisions of the UN as government departments on loan to countries. That's how I see it. It makes a whole lot more sense to me thinking about it that way. Yeah, then he jumps across to the second original point, which is divided by economic and social patterns. While the economic life of Western society has been increasingly successful in satisfying our material needs, the social aspect has become increasingly frustrating. There was a time not long ago when the chief aims of most Western men was for greater material goods and for rising standards of living. This was achieved at great social costs by the attrition or even destruction of much of social life, including the sense of community, fellowship, leisure, and social amenities. Looking backward, we are fully aware of these costs in the original factory towns and urban slums. But looking about us today, we are often not aware of the great, often intangible costs of middle-class living in suburbia or in the dormitory environs that surround European cities. The destruction of social companionship and solidarity, the narrowing influence of exposure to persons from a restricted age group or from a narrow segment of social class, the horrors of commuting, the incessant need for constant driving about to satisfy the ordinary needs of family for groceries, medical care, entertainment, religion, or social experience, the prohibitive cost and the inconvenience of upkeep and repairs, and in general the whole way of life of the suburban rat race. And I think every single one of us who reads or has read through this part was just nodding along in agreement. I think that Quigley knocks it out the park. He describes it as it is. On the whole, the efforts to find a way out while still remaining a high standard of material living have not been successful, and real rebellion is coming, and as we shall see later, from their children. He goes on to just explain that the zeitgeist following World War II and the subsequent generations going up until our time, how things have shifted. People are, because their lives are so dull and hemmed in, they are seeking, nowadays, they're seeking experiences. They want to travel overseas as much as they can. They are doing these things to seek authenticity because their lives have become mechanized and specialized and isolated. And they are seeking small group interpersonal relationships and sex play. So we see deviancy. People are seeking sensation. The social costs of the contemporary economic system are staggering. On the whole, they have been widely discussed and are generally recognized. As economic enterprises have become larger and more tightly integrated into one another, the freedom, individualism, and initiative traditionally associated with the modern economy have to be sacrificed. The self-reliant individual has gradually changed into the conformist organization man. Routine governs their life. Subordination to abstractions has replaced the struggle with diverse concrete problems. The constantly narrowing range of possibilities for self-expression has given rise to deep frustrations with the concomitant growth of irrational compensating customs, such as the obsession with speed, vicarious combativeness, especially in sports, booze, tobacco, narcotics, and sex as stimulants, diversions, and sedatives, and the rapid appearance and disappearance of fads in dress, social custom, and leisure activities. And then I ask myself, what's changed? If this was the 60s, and we know the 60s they had various sudden booms and changes in culture, but it's just been carrying on. Just look at the modern day. He mentions that there's a group called the lumpen proletariat. It's a disaffected, seething, discontented, or malcontented, or maladapted group of people in the lower classes, the lower middle class. They just can't adjust. And he reckons that they are very, very dangerous. And I think the internet has come along and neutralized these people quite a lot. He mentions that these people were in America, they were the blacks or the Latin Americans, and they had their racial and economic problems. Quigley reckons that it's really just an educational, social problem to tackle in the future. Their self-perpetuating characteristic as a group is not based on biological differences, but on sociological factors, chiefly on the fact that disorganized, undisciplined, present preference parents living under chaotic economic and social conditions are most likely to train their children like their parents. Like their children in the organized, disciplined feature preference and orderly habits of the modern economic system. Once again, he's describing South Africa again. There's just a mindset where it's self-perpetuating misery, which very simple changes in mindset could get them out. Having lots and lots of children that no one can afford. And the problem perpetuates. The children, before they even end their teens, are having children. It's quite frustrating to watch. And they can't get a proper full education or finish school. But with simple changes, that's where I actually am in agreement with people like Quigley. It's not necessarily about eugenics or anything like that. It's just about basic outlooks, and I actually see it. I'm seeing things turn around in South Africa. I think there is a little bit of hope for the middle class, particularly a that starts setting an example for others in the culture to still maintain the culture, but unfortunately you have to adapt, and that is where Quigley comes in with his Western outlook, is that it is very, very adaptable. Then he jumps to outlooks, the intellectual and religious aspects of any society, including all those things I call pattern of outlook, change at least as rapidly as the more material aspects of the society. They're generally less noticed. He discusses human nature. Human beings have various aspects to their nature. There's a material, there's the body, then there's the emotional center, or the intuitive part of the human, and then there is the higher mind, which is able to self-reflect and analyze itself. And human beings have a very, very hard time sticking to any one area. They tend to migrate from a basic state of preferring a fictional account of the world, alternating to a factual-based view of the world, making use of those higher functions of the mind, and then they want to switch back again to fiction, and it seems to alternate like that. And human beings have a frustrating lack of, they have this desire to tell themselves little white lies all the time. And I think the likes of Quigley and his ilk, they talk about, they ultimately want to change the structure and the mind of man. They want to take away individuality, and they can do it now with the needle, with genetic modification. And I think that this facet, what Quigley covers here on patterns of outlook, I think they probably going to be art science. It's going to be a point where trying to get people or to manipulate people into behaving a certain way won't have to be done anymore by using churches or philosophers or schools. It's probably going to get to the point where it can be genetically engineered into the next group. So Quigley just goes on to say that despite all the confusion you get between individuals, if you look back on history, you can see distinct prevalent patterns of outlook that you can trace. And he mentions that the human being, the average human being, or the human, he lives in a five-dimensional so three of those dimensions are spatial. The fourth dimension is time, and the fifth is the world of abstraction, the world of ideas. And men alternate between these dimensions. Even within one person's lifetime, some people alternate between these extremes in a day. So thus man might look at his own being as divided into three levels of body, emotions, and reason. And the body, functioning directly in space-time abstraction, is much concerned with concrete situations, individual and unique events at a specific time and place. The middle levels of his being are concerned with himself and his reactions to reality in terms of feelings and emotions as determined by endocrine and neurological reactions. The upper levels of his being are concerned with his neurological analysis and manipulation of conceptualized abstractions. The three corresponding operations of his being are sensual, emotional, or intuitive and rational. Sensual, intuitive, and rational. Quigley, when he goes on later and he finishes off to pontificate on and on about how wonderful the Western outlook is, and how it will save the world, and how the Western outlook is the scientific outlook, and that it is tolerant, etc., etc., etc. He goes on to describe how the Western outlook tries to balance all three of these aspects of the human being together to create a balanced Western take on reality. He talks about the various ages of time in the last few hundred years. In the Western outlook, he talks about the age of enlightenment, where man took another look at the world and applied a rational overlay to it. They saw the world as a world based on mechanical laws. The thing is that outlook, this mechanistic outlook, simply doesn't suit the human being, and it results in excesses. It becomes, if you unbalance in your view, you develop unhealthy ideologies, and you try and implement them and force them on others. And this resulted, according to Quigley, in the French Revolution. This was followed by the Romantic period, where they took a step back and had a much more irrational picture of man, of society. As a consequence, emphasis shifted from the earlier rational, mechanical, and static views to irrational and dynamic views of man and society. The third, then the next age was that of science and rationalism, typified by people like Darwin. It emphasized the empirical and rational aspects of science. It also tried to apply these to biology and to history in terms of a scientific materialism. It tries to take the mystery out of life itself, and it simply doesn't work. The result of that was an age of irrational activism. It began with men like Henri Bergson and Sigmund Freud, who emphasized the non-rational nature of the universe and man, and quickly shifted Darwin's doctrines of struggle and survival from non-human nature to human society, and rejected rationalism as slow, superficial, and an inhibition on both action and survival. It resulted in the greatest period of slaughter and despair the world has ever seen. See here, basically, someone like Henri Bergson, his claim would be that reality could only be interpreted by direct experience and intuition as the most relevant form. The thinker would always be indecisive, according to these thinkers, to these people. They would argue that a rational thought could always be sent in two different directions, and both directions on any particular topic could be justified. But the man of action would always dominate the thinker. While the thinker is thinking up his theories, the man of action would step in and get things done. And that mindset was the pinnacle of that irrationalism, was the total violence of Nazism, the revolution of nihilism. Expressed explicitly, this cult of irrational activism was based on the belief that the universe was dynamic and largely non-rational. As such, any effort to deal with it by rational means would be futile and superficial. It promotes a cult of violence, which I don't think has been undone. Just look at TV. You watch a few hours of TV, you'll end up seeing how many murders and rapes. It encourages people to don't think, just fight. The Nazi Party even mobilized popular support with a program of blood and soil, Blut und Boden, while the fascists in Italy covered every wall with their slogan, "Believe, obey, fight." So a very, very, very dark period in our history as human beings. In intuition, I know people say you must always trust your gut feel, that you must trust your intuition. I don't personally hold to that. I rather prefer to think of the idea of limited intuition, because your intuition is formed by the exposure to information that you take in from your environment as you go through your life. And if that information is faulty, or if you have interpreted things incorrectly, then your intuition will be affected by it. It's garbage in, garbage out. If you feed yourself garbage, you will tend to intuit the world incorrectly. So I think intuition is very important, but I think it's a case of don't jump in where angels fear to tread. Listen to your intuition and then just test it to check to see if it's correct. A lot of people feel quite intuitive about certain things and end up getting themselves into very sticky situations. The most widely read of 20th century philosophers, the existentialists, reflected the same attitude, although they could agree on almost nothing. In general, they were skeptical of any general principles about reality, but they recognized that reality did exist for each individual as the concrete instant of time, place, and context in which he acted. Thus, he must act. In order to act, he must make a decision, a commitment to something that would give him a basis from which to act. By acting, he experiences reality, and to that extent, knows and demonstrates at least to himself that there is a reality. All these ideas reflected the disjointed malaise of the century, permeated the outlook of the period, and left it hungry for meaning. That's what everyone talks about these days. They're going out to search for themselves. They're always looking for meaning. So once again, speed, alcohol, sex, coffee, tobacco screened man off from living, injuring his health, stultifying his capacity to think, to observe, or to enjoy life, without his realizing that these were the shields he adopted to conceal from himself the fact that he was no longer really capable of living, because he no longer knew what life was and could see no meaning or purpose in it. Let's see. People are seeking meaning, they're seeking experiences. I think I'm ready to pack things up on my side. Let's see. And then he goes on and on and on about how the Western outlook is not an outlook which is monistic or dualistic. It's not stuck between one extreme view and the other. It tends to take a look at both. It weighs things up. It in a sense, Quigley claims that it traditionally invented, in air quotes, the scientific method in its general outlook, and that the West will not jump to conclusions and hold on to them. It will weigh things up in a temporary consensus as it gathers new information. And I agree with many of it, a lot of it, but I don't think anyone should be necessarily sold on what Quigley calls the Western outlook, because that Western outlook, I think, is a little bit shaped and will continue to be shaped in you could call it scientific outlook. You can call it the Western outlook today. Tomorrow it's the scientific outlook, and then without realizing it, unless you have an individual outlook and you really personally think through everything, if you just float along with the West, you might find yourself in a place that you didn't want to end up in. And if you take a look at some of these modern day talking heads like Douglas Murray and these various like Jordan Peterson, and they talk about how the West, and this is what we need to do to save the West. They can direct people to saving the West, and that could mean anything. And be very, very careful of sales pitches like Carroll Quigley. A lot of these things do sound very good, and I do agree with it. But, if you just give in to the West is best and the East is a beast, you're not doing any more thinking after that. You're just going to float along. So don't do that. Yeah, he finishes off with the virtue of scientists, how scientists are so humble and honest. The most triumphant of these aspects is science, whose method is a perfect example of the Western tradition. The scientist goes eagerly to work. The scientist goes eagerly to work each day because he has the humility to know that he does not have any final answers and must work to modify and improve the answers he has. He's just such a wonderful creature. And if you put science on a pedestal, which has happened in the West, then who are you to dare criticize it? You put anything on a pedestal, it becomes Lord and Master over you. So, as we know, the science has been used to further a whole lot of these global agendas that are going to and are putting us into narrower and narrower confines of reality, while we determine what is what we do with our life, how we think about travel, how all of this kind of thing is being scientifically redefined for us. But in order for it to be redefined for us, we have to accept that science has the authority to do it in the first place. That's very, very subtle. To a lot of people out there don't realize that they've been convinced into worshipping a new God. And that new God is science. He talks about the liberal, how the liberal outlook itself can shift 180 degrees. I just wrote there, that which you hate or oppose without thinking, well, you become. I forget who said it. Was that Nietzsche? I forget who said it. If you stare too long into the abyss, you'll be surprised who's staring back at you, and you'll find that it's yourself staring back at you. So it's the importance of not becoming obsessed, thinking clearly and calmly, to picking teams and sides, even ones that are so well written and explained so nicely by the likes of Jordan Peterson and Carroll Quigley and many others. Remember, everything out there is basically a sales pitch, so be very careful. Let's see here. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much for listening.